Hello, Dr. Bittu. Welcome to Center for Regional Research and Sustainability Studies. We are very thrilled to have you for the first edition of Unspoken. Of course, Dr. Bittu doesn't need an introduction, so should we just jump right in?
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, why are activists opposing the Transgender Act?
It's gone through various iterations, and there have been improvements based on the many criticisms we've had. The first, of course, the first bill was a bill drafted by Tiruchi Siva in consultation with the trans community of Tamil Nadu. So that bill was overall very well made because it was drafted largely with inputs from the community. And it set a standard for what we might expect from a bill. Right? It was extremely useful. It laid out provisions for reservation, for medical care, for reservations in employment and education, medical care, housing. The actual problems that the community faces were addressed by the bill. The government of India then, this was a private member's bill which got passed in the Rajya Sabha, and is not uncommon. The government of India set up its own bill. The problem, however, is that the Government of India bill was at first just an extremely watered down and badly written version of the Tiruchi Siva bill, with every empowering provision removed. Right, so everything that was useful to us was stripped from it, and so our initial objection was just that it had become a useless piece of paper. Following which it was then revised to include several harmful provisions for the community, including the rolling back of the Nalsa judgments, the Supreme Court judgment, which gives us the right to self-determination. This was rolled back by the Act, which then required us to apply to the government for permission to identify legally in the categories in which we identify, and required government certification and medical proof, all in opposition to the Nalsa judgment, in order for us to get binary identity documents from the government. And then of course several other problems. Penal provisions were introduced which were discriminatory, which could be used against the trans community. Some of those were changed, but we continue to essentially have penal provisions for sexual assault on trans people be vastly less than provisions for equivalent assaults upon cis women, sexual assaults upon cis women. And then there's, again, a lot of bad, shoddy phrasing in the bill. So provisions that have been used in other legislations to govern the rights of transgender children have been replicated here without the word children. So suddenly all trans adults are supposed to live with our parents, or approach a court to be put in a shelter home. And the language of rehabilitation is used in the bill, suggesting that this government will do what many governments do, which is to incarcerate trans people in various shelters, which are often themselves fairly abusive situations. And families of choice, the Hijra Parivar, the Kinnar Parivar, these are all unrecognized. Adoptive and civil rights, of course, are not there, and of course, all of the welfare measures that we need are also not there. There is a section on the bill on non-discrimination which just essentially says, "Thou shalt not discriminate," without actually, defining discrimination, providing penalties for particular kinds of discrimination, and therefore, again, that part of it becomes useless on paper. One can point to it saying the government says you should not discriminate, but it doesn't actually give somebody a right to recourse. And likewise, right.
So it doesn't state what exactly you mean by discrimination.
That's right. And then that essentially means that one doesn't have recourse if one is discriminated against. Also the kinds of penalties which it does provide for stem from a lack of imagination or lack of understanding of what people actually face in India. So there are penalties for lack of access to public space, which, that's not the problem that trans people typically face, right? It's a problem that other categories of that trans people face outside of India. But in India, the problems that trans people face are largely a lack of access to spaces of employment, spaces of education, and those are not addressed. Yeah.
So could you maybe elaborate a little bit on how identity-related issues, or say document-related issues, affect transgender communities?
I think one of the problems that, I mean, there are several problems with documentation, right? People have problems with all kinds of documentation right now. Nobody is able to take advantage of any government schemes around the lockdown because nobody has bank accounts, nobody has ration cards. So, trans people are falling through the cracks with respect to all of these. Most people have Aadhaar cards because Aadhaar sort of explicitly sort of made itself accessible to trans persons, probably in a bid to boost Aadhaar registrations. So people enroll despite privacy concerns. Many people have voter ID cards, but the other documentations are sort of fairly hard to, fairly out of reach. The passport office never implemented the Nalsa judgment in terms of, providing people changes that were not linked to medicalized documents. But I would say really the thing that has been hardest for people, which there is some, the act may actually, thankfully, the only, I think, useful thing that the act has done is that it has provided for the opportunity to change educational documents. Now, again, the Nalsa judgment was fairly clear, and that these educational boards should have also changed, should have responded to the Nalsa judgment directly and changed, and made the the option available to people to change their names on educational documents. But the act mandates it. That I think that will help. And the problem essentially that people have faced so far without being able to change their educational documents and birth certificates is that they have, when you apply for a job, you're essentially submitting inconsistent documents. If you have identity documents in one name, you look like the identity on that document, and then you have educational documents in another name. So yeah, some of those problems, I think that's one major problem. It gives people enough information with which they can discriminate against you. Whereas if these documents get changed, then one can just submit consistent documents and one doesn't have to out oneself as trans to a potential employer.
So coming back to the misconceptions about the transgender identity, could you tell us how the act differentially affects persons who identify as non-binary or say gender fluid, gender queer, not necessarily within the male, female or trans man, trans woman framework?
Right. Well, I think it's a lot is a matter of definition. There are some trans activists who identify as Tritiya Pankti, right? Who identify in a category that's kind of not binary, but there's been a lot of debate on this. I mean, it's a long and complicated trajectory. Essentially, some people who are Tritiya Pankti or Kinnar have wanted the government to explicitly not include them in the purview of the bill, saying, look, apply these to people who consider themselves transgender. We're a social-cultural category. Leave us out of it. There are other people who have wanted, such as people who are on this new transgender council, who have wanted the category transgender to prevail over binary categories because they identify as non-male and non-female. Right? So they think everyone should identify as transgender, and the binary trans folks do not want to identify as transgender. And they have failed to understand each other. I think there is a framework within which one can have space for everyone who is non-binary and binary by just essentially allowing people to self-identify as per the Nalsa judgment, of course. But within the governmental framework, so in some sense, the government is guilty of prioritizing a certain kind of non-binary identity in that they think the word transgender means not male, not female, right? This the notion, the cultural notion of Kinnar is really the government's imagination of the word transgender. So in some sense, I think binary people are more excluded and hurt by this idea of what the government thinks of as transgender, and it is a not binary idea, but not necessarily a non-binary idea. The idea of non-binary and genderqueer politics is really to imagine beyond the limitations of the binary, rather than to conceptualize these as failures to fit in the binary, right? These are different ways of looking, or as some kind of running race in which men get the first gender and women get the second gender and trans people get the third gender, right? I mean, I think those very demeaning and hierarchical frameworks are not what some of us who identify as non-binary would want to think of ourselves in terms of. So yes, I think that the government is not necessarily, so the government is absolutely ignorant of or willfully ignoring the concerns of people who are non-binary and genderqueer and trans. But I think there are also contestations with binary trans folks, where binary trans folks have been sidelined by the government because they have this very particular idea of what it means to be trans, and they are completely disinterested in revising their own misconceptions.
Exactly. I think, trans is often seen as a cultural identity rather than a gender identity.
Yeah.
So, I mean, people don't understand it's something internal to what a person feels about themselves instead of how they live or what their lifestyle is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, could you maybe tell us what are the kinds of barriers that transgender people or, say, non-binary people face in academia?
Well, as I said, the usual problem is just it begins as an entry problem. It's difficult to have any kind of conversation with an employer when the employer has enough information on your application form to say, well, I think this is a fraudulent application. There are two names, there are two genders, what's going on? So there's an entry problem. That's the first problem, I think, with respect to academia. Then, of course, in school, starting from school and college and onwards, there are often various things that happen in educational and workspaces that make it a hostile space. Some of these are explicit assaults, physical, sexual, verbal, heckling, right? But there are other things as well that can happen even when people are not intending to be mean or transphobic. Just their lack of recognition of one's of your gender and repeated misgendering, which I think all of us have faced. That by itself can be enough to make one not want to be in the workspace. So I think those things are hard for people who are well-meaning cisgendered allies to understand.
I feel that like interview panels and employers end up asking a lot of intrusive personal questions which are not at all related to your skills or the kind of expertise required at your workplace. So
the number of people and the number of people I've met in a professional workspace who feel free to ask me sexual questions simply because I'm trans, right? The understanding being like, no holes barred with this person. So these I think are,
So could you maybe tell us a little bit about how being located in, say, disadvantaged intersectional positions, trans people located in disadvantaged intersectional positions be affected by this act? Say, Dalit transgender persons or Muslim transgender persons who are not really in a privileged position like us, maybe you or me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think a lot depends on how the Trans Act, in terms of the seriousness, the possible seriousness of this, a lot depends on how the Trans Act intersects with the CAA and the NRC and the NPR, because we really think Muslim trans persons, Dalit and Adivasi trans persons are probably going to face and working class trans persons are probably going to face the worst of it when it comes to suspicions of foreignerness, a lack of availability of birth certificates and various other family related documents and lineage documents and so on. So but really with or without the CA, with or without the Trans Act, there's a long history of incarceration of trans persons on no legal grounds, right? Or on the grounds of various perfectly justifiable laws, various laws around perpetrating financial fraud and so on are just generously applied to trans people. It's not like we're saying there shouldn't be these sections, right? Or kidnapping, these are the standard charges that are framed against trans persons. We're not saying that these laws shouldn't exist, but that at all, right? So even where there are perfectly legitimate laws, which are often used against trans people by police, and the police demand money or sexual work, sex work in return for dropping these charges. These are all part of the way in which trans people commonly, interact with the state.
So lastly, what would your advice be to young transgender people or young queer people who are exploring their gender identity?
I would just say that, we're all working very hard to try and create a world which is more friendly to young trans persons than before. We are very far from succeeding in even providing what any of us might consider a safe environment in which to come out. But But it's just important that anyone who's exploring their gender identity know that there are lots and lots of support structures, and that I'm certainly always available to be there for anyone who needs a hand. And there's a much larger community who's also sort of there for you. So just get in touch. You know, exploring one's gender identity is often something that's so fraught with questions of familial and social acceptance that people really only do it when they are really strongly questioning their gender. And I think we want that to not be the case. We want there to be no barriers for people to just explore gender as much as they'd like. And of course, some of us ideologically don't even believe there is such a thing as gender, and that, you know, that it's a social construct which people can really, whether they're trans or not, should really critically examine and deconstruct.
I think a lot of teenagers or say baby trans people, what they face is that the struggle to identify into one particular label. So you identify as one label, and then there's always a new word coming up the next day. Yeah. So your identity is always in flux. So what would you say to people who are struggling with that?
Well, I have also always found labels quite limiting, but I've never been bothered by changes. The idea of new words is not that you have to latch onto a word so that you can explain yourself to other people, right? New words are there if linguistically they make you feel like they describe your experience better than something else. And if they do, just feel free. I mean, nobody should pressure themselves to kind of maintain continuity with past identities, and at the same time, nobody should feel that they have to renegotiate everything as soon as they hear a new word, right? The categories are there to support; they're not there to chain you in, and so it's important to not chain oneself in to them, and feel pressured either to negotiate with a new category or to stay with an old category.
Right.
I think the more narratives one hears, the more one sort of starts to think, well, this didn't, speak to me as much as that. So maybe, if I look for more people who are, and identities are just short forms for longer conversations, right? So eventually we all have these longer conversations, and that's where we find our liberation. And the identities, the labels are just something that they're like an abstract or a keyword, right? They help you navigate towards people in the community who you think might share your experiences. So it should be unsurprising. It's not like you'll use the same Google keywords today to search for something you're looking for as you will tomorrow. So why feel any more chained to these labels than you would to how you search in Google?
I think that's it. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
It's really great chatting with you and finally meeting you. Like, I've been a
That's
fan
right.
for a long time.
Likewise, I'm so sorry that we've had to reschedule this multiple times.
It's all right. But we managed ultimately, so that's what matters.
Well, just one last thing, and so as Unspoken, the platform that we are launching, apart from everything else that we do, is a platform for transgender people, not only just create awareness about them, but also give them the platform to come write for us or talk to us, or So if in one line, if you had to say something as something that to empower not just trans people but also everyone, be it queer or not, what would you say? Just one line, something that as in
We can only be liberated when we destroy all of the hierarchical structures that oppress us. And so the annihilation of caste, class, and gender and ableism are essential for all of our collective liberation, regardless of where your particular social location is.
Well, that's yes, certainly. Thank you so much. And it was really great talking to you and connecting to us.
Likewise. Yes. See you.
So goodbye.
See you. Yeah, bye.